Vice Chancellor Rajkumar, Professor Murthy, Justice Chauhan, my esteemed father, Fali Nariman, Mr. Ashok Desai, above all, Shubhra Verma, ladies and gentlemen. Today's subject was close to Justice Verma's heart. In fact, we may begin by saying that our constitution didn't start on a tabula rasa. It did not adopt the strict Montesquieuan doctrine of separation of powers. That's because we adopted the Westminster style of government, where the executive does have a key role in framing and then passing legislation through parliament. But broadly speaking, we do follow what Hamilton said in the Federalist Papers, the famous 78, which is that broadly speaking, it's the legislature that makes laws and therefore holds the purse. The executive, which holds the sword, which has to execute laws made, and the judiciary, which hath judgment. Today we are dealing with the legislative branch of government, and in particular Part 11 of our Constitution. Our Constitution, as you know, is a somewhat prolix document. It has 395 articles and about 12 schedules. And we'll be dealing with about 10 of these articles and one schedule, Schedule 7. What our founding fathers had before them was 4 great constitutions of the past. The first, the US Constitution of the year 1789. The second, an act of the British Parliament, the British North America Act of 1867, which was the constitution for Canada, and which continues even after 1984 to be part or to be a constitutional document which still serves Canada. The 1900 Commonwealth of Australia Act, which again is an act of the British Parliament, and finally the 1935 Government of India Act. Now, interestingly enough, insofar as today's subject is concerned, there are 2 diametrically opposed visions which emerge from these constitutions. One is the vision of a true federation, which is the vision of the US Constitution and the Commonwealth of Australia Act. Because the states in the US were independent and sovereign, just as the territories in Australia happen to be independent and sovereign, governed by their own constitutions. So what was done was, the states continued to be governed by their constitutions, despite a federal setup, and continued to be able to make laws under those constitutions. The federal legislature in both these countries was only given enumerated subjects upon which they could make laws. In the US Constitution, these are to be found in Article 1, Section 8. What is important to remember is that there is no exclusivity with Congress. It is only given a certain power to make laws with respect to 19 items found in Section 8. Otherwise, under the 10th Amendment to the US Constitution, the states continue with their constitutions, and all rights which are not expressly given to the Congress continue to vest with the states. We have the same vision with the Commonwealth of Australia Act, because there again, in Section 51, you have a number of enumerated subjects which the federal legislature may make laws upon. And under Section 106 in fact, read with 109, the states continue with their lawmaking powers under their constitutions. And only if there happens to be an actual clash between a state law made under its constitution and, let us say, a congressional law or a federal legislative law made under this list, would the state law have to yield. Now, this was one vision which our founding fathers did not accept, for the good reason that despite the fact that we ultimately emerged from British India and the princely states, the princely states, by their instruments of accession, ultimately agreed almost unconditionally to give up power. so that they did not retain any vestige of what they had as states' powers after our constitution came into force. It is only the state of Jammu and Kashmir which posed a slightly different problem. And here we have a very interesting model of a federal constitution in India with, in fact, two different visions. One for the rest of the states and one for Jammu and Kashmir for historical reasons. Jammu and Kashmir, unlike the US and the Australian models, was given the power after our constitution came into force to frame its own constitution. A constituent assembly was separately set up for this state in 1952, and in 1957 they actually framed a constitution for themselves. So interestingly enough, though India is a union of states which includes the state of Jammu and Kashmir, so far as all the other states are concerned, there is one set of laws that operate. But so far as the state of Jammu and Kashmir is concerned, it is only what the president ultimately allows in terms of our constitutional provisions to apply to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which would operate there. We'll come to this a little later in the speech. But remember, therefore, that our federation, therefore, consists of two sets of laws, not one. One for the state of Jammu and Kashmir, one for the rest of India. Now, coming to the vision of the other constitutions which I referred to, which were before the Founding Fathers. The other constitutions were the British North America Act, which governed Canada, and the 1935 Government of India Act. These were markedly different from the US and Australia in that exclusive powers were given. Mind you, there were no exclusive powers, if you remember, so far as the US and Australia are concerned, except in one very small area, which is where they set up the seat of the federal government. Exclusive powers were given, both under the British North America Act and here, to the central legislature and to the provincial legislatures. In fact, the concept of lists or subjects by which a legislature may make laws begins really with Section 91 of the British North America Act, an act of 1867. Here you had a list of subjects, small list, it was about 16 subjects, given to the federal legislature, and a slightly larger list given to the provinces under Section 92. Interestingly enough, there was no concurrent list. And mind you, the US and Australia, because of their the nature of their legislative relations, have never had a concurrent list. But Section 95 of the British North America Act said that there would be concurrent power with only two subjects, agriculture and immigration. So we had this particular vision before us. And then we had the full-blown vision of the Government of India Act of 1935, which had in sections 99 and 100, read with the 7th schedule, a full-blown central list in list 1, an equally full-blown state list in list 2, and a number of subjects which were concurrent powers to be shared by both states. Ultimately, we accepted the British North America Act model and the Government of India Act model. And this talk will be to tell you the wisdom of that acceptance. Article 245, which is the first article in Part 11, essentially demarcates legislative powers between Parliament, as we know it here, and the states. And the first important thing that it says is that Parliament may make laws. Therefore, the distinction between making and declaring law is clear in our Constitution. Courts declare law, Parliament makes them. So Parliament makes laws with respect to the whole or any part of the territory of India. This is important because the British North America Act model dealt with federal central matters which were of national import as opposed to provincial matters which were of local import. Our constitution does not have that distinction. So long as something is within its legislative power, the central legislature may legislate even on matters purely of a local nature. So we are told Parliament may make laws for the whole or part of the territory of India. And one other interesting thing, such laws may also operate extraterritorial, which means even outside the boundary of India. In fact, List 1 contains several subjects on which Parliament may make laws which would operate only outside India. For example, fishing beyond territorial waters, entry 56, List 1. Or crimes on the high seas, entry 19, List 1, and things like of that sort. But so far, therefore, as Parliament is concerned, so far as or so long as there is an Indian nexus to the law may operate all over the world. The same is not the case with the states. The states may only make laws under Article 245 for their own territories. And mind you, their own territories are liable to be changed under our constitution even without their consent. This is another interesting facet of our constitution, where by an ordinary law under Articles 3 and 4, Parliament may make what is called a constitutional amendment, altering the boundaries of any state, adding to it, subtracting from it, making a new state, deleting a state. All that it has to do is to intimate that state whose boundaries are going to be affected, ascertain its views, and then do exactly what it likes. But coming back to Article 245(2), a state legislature can only make laws which operate within the territorial boundaries of that state. Which is why we come to one of many interesting doctrines that our court has laid down. I'll be dealing with 5 of them in the course of this lecture. And the first is the doctrine of extraterritorial effect. Because what happens is, suppose, for example, there is a law which deals with a trust which is situated in a particular state, which is in fact the fact situation in Charusila Devi's case, which is the 1959 judgment of our court. Then the law may also operate extraterritorially so long as there is a nexus of that operation with something within the state. And that nexus has to be something real. So, for example, if you are dealing with the trust and the trustees situated in the state of Bihar, then notwithstanding that properties may be owned by the trust outside the state, you may still legislate in such a way that those properties can be affected and the law will be upheld. Interestingly, just before this judgment, Tisco versus the Union of India, which is a 1958 judgment, and perhaps the last judgment that the great Vivian Bose signed as an ad hoc judge before he retired, dealt also with this doctrine. Of course, the majority said that a particular sale which would have taken place outside the state but for the definition of the state legislature was held to be intra vires and held to be valid because of this particular doctrine. Justice Bose differed and differs quite vigorously. What he said was that there can only be one sale. A sale is not a body with several limbs, so that each state can grab hold of some part of it, a quivering liver here, the stomach here, the hand here, the head there. He put it very picturesquely. And ultimately he said that if the majority judgment was to be accepted, it would be like several hawks swooping down upon this one sale and tearing it up and eating different parts of it. And he ended by saying, some hawks, some sale, which takes us back to Churchill's great Ottawa speech on 30th December 1941 in the middle of World War II, where he spoke about General Pétain after the Battle of France, saying that Britain would have its neck wrung like a chicken within three months or 3 weeks. And ultimately, of course, Britain was able to stave off the great Luftwaffe invasion, so that Churchill was able to say some chicken, some neck. So this doctrine of territorial nexus, therefore, was something interesting that our courts laid down, so far as laws of state legislatures under Article 245(2) is concerned. We get on to the major article, which is 246. And this lays down a very interesting legislative scheme. First and foremost, it says that there are different subjects that are demarcated in each of the lists in the 7th schedule. If, for some reason, the subjects overlap or there is some difficulty in reconciling them, then at all times, list 1, that is the central list, must prevail over the state list and the concurrent list. Secondly, it goes on to say, if there happens to be a clash between a subject in list 3 and list 2, which is the state list, then again the concurrent list prevails over the state list. And subject to this, the states have exclusive power. The word exclusive is important, to make laws within their ken. Now, given this legislative pattern, the first thing that came before the courts was, how do you reconcile these various entries? And the common sense practical method is the method of harmonious construction. So that Justice Subbarao in the Calcutta gas case was able to say that when you have industries in entry 24 list 2, subject to industries that Parliament may legislate upon, either for defense purposes or otherwise, and you have gas and gas works immediately after in entry 25, reconciling these two entries doesn't mean robbing one of them of its content. And the better way, therefore, of reconciling them by applying this doctrine is to say that the entire industrial and other aspects of gas and gas work continue to remain in entry 25, so that no part of gas and gas works can be dealt with by Parliament. A strong argument was made on the other side, saying that unlike any other industry, suppose the centre wanted to deal with gas and gas works later, what would be the position? Justice Subbarao pointed out there are several other articles which deal with such situations, which I will also be dealing with today, such as an emergency provision article or a Rajya Sabha 2/3 resolution article, which would permit them in certain limited circumstances to deal with gas and gas works. So that was also turned down. So the first principle, therefore, our courts laid down when you construe Article 246 is this doctrine of harmonious construction. If, however, there is irreconcilable conflict, then you must read one entry subject to the other. Now, for example, suppose you have the CBI, which is a separate entry, entry 9 in list 1, Central Bureau of Investigation, and you have police as entry 2 in list 2, and there is a clash between the two as to who is to investigate, then the police must yield to the CBI, and so on. This brings me now to the effect of laws that are made under Article 246, because this is a separate subject from and is sometimes mixed up with the entries and how they are to be construed. These are now laws made under those entries. And in order to test whether a law is made within a particular entry or is outside that particular entry, we have relied very heavily on the Canadian cases, which the Privy Council laid down in judgments dealing with the British North America Act and dealing with exclusivity of powers of the centre and the states. A word about the Privy Council first. The Privy Council is an ancient institution which goes back to the King and his Council of Ministers itself. And by some minute of 1627, which was in the time of Charles I, the Privy Council was told that all that you can give is advice, be it ministerial or judicial, And when you give advice, please give it in one voice. We do not want dissentience for the simple reason that the advice then becomes obfuscated. This is the practice that the Privy Council and the Judicial Committee which evolved out of it, after, of course, Lord Brougham's great amendment in 1833, you had a separate Judicial Committee of the Privy Council overseeing most of the world and most of the colonies of the British Empire and laying down laws for them. But the peculiarity of the Privy Council, even the Judicial Committee, was that there was no dissentient opinion. So much so that Chief Justice Gajendra Gatkar, in his autobiography, says that when he met Justice Jaikar, who was first a judge of the Federal Court, then went to the Privy Council, Justice Jaikar told him that when he sat in the Privy Council and there was some knotty question of Hindu law, he had a particular view which did not coalesce with the view of two of his English colleagues. The English colleagues, being the majority, nonetheless, told him to write the judgment in accordance with their views, which he had to do, because that was Privy Council practice. So, it is this august body that laid down laws for most of the known world. At that time, the sun indeed did not set on the British Empire, because at one end you had Canada and at the other you had Australia, with us in between. And it is this great body that then laid down these laws. Another interesting thing that Lord Haldane said in a speech in 1921, he was a great Lord Chancellor, was that despite the fact that the Privy Council sat in a dingy little room in 9 Downing Street, its effect was felt all over the world. And interestingly enough, he came out with an anecdote which may not necessarily be real or factual, but which brings out the power of this august body. He said there was a tribe in India. There's a dispute as to whether it was Northeast India or Rajasthan India, but that hardly matters. There was a tribe which was propitiating a local god. And an Englishman came upon the tribe and said, "Which god is this? It doesn't look like one of yours." The answer was, "This is the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council." They said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "Because this god is more powerful than all of ours. What it has done is to hand back our lands from an all-powerful government, British government. This even our gods couldn't do." So, interestingly enough, it is this great body that laid down laws for Canada, which were then followed here. And one of the interesting doctrines it laid down was the doctrine of what we know as pith and substance. Frankly, I don't know why this expression was used. It was used in a very early judgment. Because pith and substance really mean the same thing. Pith is the core and substance again is the core. So it's repeating that we are talking about the core of something. And they therefore laid down, and this becomes a very important doctrine when we deal with laws and as to whether they are within legislative competence or they're outside. What they laid down was that you look at the law as a whole. And this was in fact laid down even better and more felicitously in A.S. Krishna's case, one of our judgments, 57 Supreme Court. And they said, do not look at the act by dissecting it. Look at it as a whole. When you look at it as a whole, does it fall within this entry or that? As a whole, if it falls within this entry, then the entire act is good, despite the fact that some parts or even large parts of it trench upon what may be called a forbidden field. That is, on some subject it lists two or vice versa. One of the interesting cases which came before our courts, and the federal court in particular, was the great C.P. and Berar judgment of 1939, where Chief Justice Guyer had to decide what exactly was meant by the expression excise. He started out by saying that excise, as understood in England, is of very wide connotation and therefore would also include sales of goods in its ordinary connotation. But he said when we construe these legislative lists, we have to see that excise is in the central list and taxes on sale of goods happens to be in the state list. So obviously whatever excise may mean in England, it can't bear the same meaning here and has to be cut down by the entry in list 2. So that excise was therefore held to be a tax only on manufacture and not on sale. Equally interesting in Subramaniam Chettiar's case, which was again a federal court judgment in 1941, you had a sharp difference of opinion, this time between Chief Justice Guyer and Justice Suleiman. There they had to decide whether a Madras Agriculturist Debt Relief Act was within its ken or whether it stepped outside and dealt with negotiable instruments like promissory notes, which were governed only by list 1. Here again, Chief Justice Guyer followed the Canadian cases and said in pith and substance, this act happens to be a debt relief measure. Because it's a debt relief measure, in substance, it falls only under debt relief, which is in list 2, despite the fact that it says that the rates of interest on pronotes will be scaled down to X as a measure of debt relief, which is in diametric contrast to the Negotiable Instruments Act made under list 1, where pronotes, if nothing is said on the face of the note, is to carry an interest at a certain particular rate. And therefore there was a direct clash between these two legislations. But nonetheless, Chief Justice Guyer upheld the entire legislation by saying that really speaking, the object of the act was rural indebtedness. It so happened that the instrument of debt may be a pronote, may be a check, may be anything. But that cannot affect the pith and substance of the act, so to speak. And therefore, the provision scaling down interest would be valid despite a direct clash with the Negotiable Instruments Act made under list 1. Justice Suleiman differed. And interestingly, in his dissent, stated that whereas the Canadian cases, and mind you, he also followed the Canadian cases. He said, whereas the Canadian cases have laid down this doctrine, they have also laid down the exception to this doctrine, which is that you may tolerate a trespass. That is, when you see the act as a whole, the act as a whole is under this entry, but this portion of it actually trespasses into forbidden territory. You may tolerate that trespass so long as there is no clash. He put it very beautifully. So if there happens to be legislation under that other entry and there's a direct clash between the two, then sorry, this must give way. Now, we have accepted Chief Justice Guyer's vision. We have not accepted the dissenting judgment of Justice Suleiman. So this is as far as this interesting doctrine goes, pith and substance. Interestingly enough, the aspect doctrine, which is also sometimes spoken of as being something different, is really nothing but the pith and substance doctrine viewed at from a slightly different angle. And this became clear from the Bank of Khulna judgment in 1944. This time the Chief Justice was Sir Patrick Spence. And mind you, this was really the very first super session, if we are going to talk of super sessions, because Justice Vardacharya was senior to it, despite which Patrick Spence, an Englishman, was brought over his head. And Chief Justice Patrick Spence, after quoting from the famous treaty Lefroy on Canadian constitutional law, said that when viewed, and this time it was a Bengal Moneylenders Act, when viewed in its true aspect, this is the expression he used, from the legislator's point of view, it would fall only within money lending, and therefore, despite the fact that it incidentally trenched upon pronotes, which were in list 1, it would be valid. Here I have an interesting tale to tell in which my father and I were both involved. Chief Justice Venkatachalaya, at the time when he was not a Chief Justice, upheld both the Expenditure Tax Act, if you remember, saying that Parliament could lay down such a tax under the residuary entry, and luxury tax, which was laid down by the states under entry 62 of list 2. In doing so, he used the aspect doctrine in a way suggesting that it is something different from pith and substance, and said that when you view the Expenditure Tax Act from this aspect, that is expenditure, it's valid here. When you view it from luxury, the very same tax, when viewed from the point of view of luxury, is valid, though it falls under list 2. Now, having done a little research myself, and having been, I think, council number 8 or 9 at that point of time, with my father in the lead, the expenditure tax was raised from 10 to 20%. And a writ petition was promptly filed under Article 32, saying that this raise was unconstitutional. And we all went to court, and Justice Venkatachalaya, as he then was, sitting with Justice Patnaik, the unfortunate gentleman who died, told my father that isn't this covered by a constitution bench decision? Father said yes, and more or less gave up. And I was very agitated from the side because I had done this research, you see, as a young man. And I kept telling him, say this, say this. Didn't say anything. Sat down and got dismissed. At 12:30, a message was sent to me by Justice Venkatachalaya saying, please come at 2 o'clock. I went back at 2 o'clock. He called only me. And I went back there at 2 o'clock. And the judge said, I saw that you were a little ruffled, agitated. Is there something the matter in that case? So I said, no, my lord. So he said, did you think that our throwing out this matter was not correct? I said, I only wanted to tell your lordships that. And before I could say anything, he said, tell us that our judgment is wrong. So being a junior, I said, yes, most proudly. Look at this great man. He said, tell us why. I'm interested to know. So I blurted out, said something about Lefroy, said something about how aspect is not pith and substance, said something about how aspect cannot be used for the residuary entry. It must be used when there are two competing entries. He got interested and he said, all right, we'll recall the order, and issued notice. Having issued notice, 2 weeks later, Parliament in its wisdom brought 20% back down to 10%. So most unfortunately, all that research went down the tube and we withdrew our writ petition. But coming back to what I was telling you a little earlier, the aspect doctrine. This is something again that we will have to examine because it's been used in various areas even after the Federation judgment. And it is only Justice Rumapal in another judgment that seems to have touched upon the aspect that this particular aspect doctrine does not seem to be correctly understood, but requires a little clarification. From this, we move on to the next very interesting area in Part 11, the residuary power. Now, the residuary power is contained in Article 248, which is read with the last article in List 1, or the last entry in List 1, which is entry 97. And basically it says, all matters that are not enumerated in Lists 2 and 3 can be dealt with by Parliament. Now this was a major departure from Section 104 of the Government of India. Because under 104 of the Government of India, the residuary power lay with the Governor General in Council. And he could decide subject matter wise as to whether this particular subject matter should be assigned to the center or to the states. We didn't follow that. And we gave the entire residuary power to Parliament. The first interesting case that comes to mind when we deal with this great power is the judgment in Dhillon's case. Now, Dhillon is a 1972 judgment of 7 honorable judges of the Supreme Court. And again, like most of these earth-shaking cases, the cleavage of opinion is sharp. And here again, it was decided 4-3. Interestingly enough, in the majority, was a little-known gentleman called Subimal Roy, who happened to be one of my predecessors. Why do I say one of my predecessors? He was the second, or arguably the third, which I will tell you about just now, direct appointee to the Supreme Court. He was a brilliant man. And I don't find his name in any judgments except Dhillon, for the reason that he didn't last long here. He died within 2 or 3 months of coming here. But he's a brilliant person. And we are told that another equally brilliant person may perhaps have been the first direct appointee, Justice T.L. Venkatrama Iyer. Now, apparently, this gentleman whose portrait hangs in court number 2 was a brilliant Karnataka musician, apart from being a Sanskrit scholar, better known as a musician, and a great judge. But he happened to be a judge of the Madras High Court for only 2.5 years before being elevated here. And as you know, the constitution requires at least 5 years. So the question was, how would you elevate him? And it's not very clear as to whether he was elevated as a direct appointee from the bar or whether he was elevated as an eminent jurist. So this conundrum remains. And because of this conundrum, either I am number 5 in the list or number 6 in the list. Interestingly enough, even in the United States, you have this conundrum in a different setup. You had a Justice Rutledge, who was the second Chief Justice of the United States. De facto, he served as Chief Justice for 2 months, but he wasn't confirmed by the Senate. So therefore, very often you find the great Chief Justice Marshall being referred to as number 3 or number 4, depending upon whether you look at the de facto position or the de jure position. So coming back to Dhillon's case, we had this sharp cleavage, as I told you. And we had Chief Justice Sikri, who headed the majority, with 2 other learned judges, one of whom was Subimal Roy, and an exactly diametrically opposed viewpoint by 3 other honorable judges. Justice Shelott leading 2 others, and a final viewpoint by Justice Mitter, which was then a standalone judgment. What did this case deal with, and how did the residuary power arise? This case dealt with entry 86. Now, as you know, we have completely mutually separate taxing powers. There is no confusion in the taxing power. And so far as entry 86 is concerned, it reads thus. It says, taxes on the capital value of assets exclusive of agricultural land. A lot turns on this. Of individuals and companies. And the question there was an amendment being made to the Wealth Tax Act, which was stated to be under this entry, which amendment sought to introduce the exclusion, which is agricultural land. Now, the first thing that arose was the scope of the residuary power. And what was argued was, and incidentally, this is one of the few cases that the great Nani Palkhiwala lost in this court to the even greater MC Sethalwat. And what was argued was that the residuary power is a power which is sui generis, in the sense that you have only to see list 2, because concurrent list, in any case, you Parliament have power. So if you see list 2 and you find that the particular tax in this case doesn't fall within list 2, automatically you don't need to see anything else. Falls within the residuary power. This is what in fact the majority judgment held. But the minority judgment very shrilly opposed and said, then what you are doing is rewriting the constitution, because you are specifically told by entry 86 that you must exclude agricultural land. And the minority judgment goes on to say, every vestige and aspect of agriculture has been left to the states. So how does the center suddenly tax agriculture in this form? The answer given by the majority again was that these are only fields ultimately. The entries are not powers They are only fields of taxation. And the moment the residuary power comes in, even if entry 97 happens to be trammeled, Article 248, which is the substantive power, certainly doesn't deal with any exclusions. And all that you need to see when you see Article 248 is whether this particular tax is contained or is not contained in List 2. Another interesting argument was, and here again the minority held, that entry 49 List 2, which deals with taxes on lands and buildings, would be the entry within which this particular amendment would fall, because lands would include agricultural lands. To which the answer given by the majority was that there had to be land as a unit. It could not be a personal tax. A property tax is different from a personal tax. And therefore, when you are speaking of a property tax, you may tax agricultural land. Nobody says no. But when you are seeking to tax it as one item of personal wealth, then obviously it's outside 49 List 2. Interestingly enough, the majority of the High Court had held that this power does not belong to either of legislature, either the center or the states. Because it said it falls outside 49. It is excluded by 86. Sorry, neither of you can tax this. Which also accords with Sirvai's view, ultimately. But the majority poo-pooed it by saying that we are a sovereign democratic republic and there can be no vestige of power which is hidden somewhere or outside the plate of any legislature. Either it's here or it's there. It's not possible to conceive of a particular power which is hanging somewhere and which neither legislature can avail. Justice Mitter's view, of course, the standalone view, was to read capital value in such a way, in a narrow way, to say that, look, all that is spoken is capital value. Now, a Wealth Tax Act speaks of net capital value. You have to deduct debts, etc. So I said, no, where is this deduction of debts? That's no part of entry 86. Therefore, the Wealth Tax Act as a whole also falls only within the residuary power and not under entry 86. Interestingly enough, this arose in the obverse situation with the state of Jammu and Kashmir a few years later. Because in CWT versus Karan Singh, which is a 1993 judgment, the court was faced with whether the Wealth Tax Act itself, this time no amendment to agricultural land, but whether the Wealth Tax Act itself was under 86 or was under the residuary power. The reason being that, as I told you a little earlier, the constitution of J&K vests the residuary power with the state. And our Article 248 does not operate in Jammu and Kashmir. By a presidential order, the only residuary power that the center has, so far as the state of Jammu and Kashmir is concerned, is to tackle terrorism and things of that sort. But otherwise, the vast plenitude of the residuary power is with the state. So it was argued that the Wealth Tax Act itself, and Mitter's judgment was strongly relied upon, because Chief Justice Sikri had said nothing about the original act. They were dealing only with the Amendment Act. Justice Shelat, the minority, went to great lengths to point out how the original act was within 86. And that this amendment, being contrary to the exclusion in 86, would have to be excluded for that reason. So the court was really faced with a dilemma. Majority here in 7 judges, 3 of them say nothing. The 3 minority reached the conclusion that the Wealth Tax Act is only under entry 86. And Justice Mitter holds the opposite. So it's really a 3-to-1 situation. Our court decided that the Wealth Tax Act was under only entry 86. And in that sense accepted the minority view of Justice Shelat. So interestingly enough, when it came to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and we have Article 370 which deals with them, which specifically states that our constitution only applies insofar as the president may by order extend it. Second, their own constitution operates, as I told you a little earlier. And what is interesting is even the amendment power of their constitution is with them. But with this little difference, and it's a significant difference, that you amend your constitution by 2/3, not present and voting, but the entire strength of the House. You might notice that so far as our constitution is concerned, if you wish to impeach the president under Article 61, you have to have 2/3 of the entire strength of the House. But if you wish to pass a constitutional amendment, including amending that article, you can do it indirectly by having only those present and voting, subject to, of course, at least half, which has to be there because otherwise the ruling party wouldn't be there. So this other interesting little conundrum is also there. But coming back to the residuary entry and to Dhillon's case, the ultimate answers given are very interesting. And this leads us now on to another very interesting facet which is found in this conspectus of articles in Part 11. 249 is an article which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. It's a very interesting article because it says the Rajya Sabha, the Council of States, can by 2/3 present and voting vote that for a period of 1 year or for an extended period of not more than 1 year at a time, that a particular subject in the state list can be availed of by Parliament. And when it does this, obviously if there is legislation by the state already, then there's bound to be a clash. How do we resolve the clash? The clash is resolved by Article 251, which says that for the duration that parliamentary law is made under such a power, the state law will stand eclipsed. It doesn't exactly use the word eclipse, but says that it will resuscitate the moment the parliamentary law goes. And it goes 6 months after the resolution. So if the resolution is for 1 year, then for 1.5 years the parliamentary law remains, after which it's out of the statute books. And out springs back the state law. Similarly, under Article 250, suppose an emergency is declared, internal or external, the same position obtains. Parliament can legislate on any subject, including police, for example, under List 2. And the same position of eclipse obtains so far as such parliamentary law is concerned. Interestingly enough, the doctrine of eclipse laid down by our court somehow or the other arose in a completely different situation. It arose so far as pre-constitution and post-constitution laws are concerned when they offended fundamental rights. Now, unlike America again, fortunately we have express judicial review in Article 13. 13.1 deals with pre-constitutional laws and says that if they clash with a fundamental right, then they are void. It's important to note the expression used, void, as opposed to inoperative, used in Article 251, which brings in eclipse. 13.2 again says that the state shall not make any law which clashes with a fundamental right, and such law again will be void. Now, early in our constitutional history, in Keshavan Madhav Menon's case in 51, we had a vigorous dissent by Justice Fazal Ali, because Keshavan Madhav Menon was used for the proposition that the doctrine of eclipse would apply to pre-constitution laws but not to post-constitution laws. And how would it apply? Suppose a law is made in 1947. It was validly made at the time it was made. In comes the Constitution in 1950, and this law, validly made, is suddenly to be declared void because it clashes with a fundamental right. In the First Amendment, a large number of fundamental rights were themselves amended. And if that amendment would resuscitate the law in the sense that now it would no longer clash with the fundamental right, the law would spring back, according to Keshavan Madhav Menon and the later judgments, Pesi Kaka, Bikaji Narayan Dakras, etc. Justice Fazal Ali said no. He said different expressions have been used in the Constitution advisedly. The expression void means of no effect whatsoever. And the same expression is used under 13.1 as well as in 13.2. So if the same expression is used, it must have the same effect. There's no question of something clashing with a fundamental right and only lying stunned until the fundamental right itself is amended so that the stunned law comes back into being after the stunner disappears. This vision has not somehow or the other been accepted by our courts. And strictly speaking, I mean literally speaking, Justice Fazal Ali is right. Because when you want to have an eclipse, 250, 249 and 251, which were articles which were never looked at, incidentally, in any of these judgments, would make it clear that an eclipse situation is a situation which is temporary in nature. It is temporary in the sense that a superior legislature, because of some reason, is given a certain power which it does not possess. And for a short time. It's only when that time is over that the already made state law resuscitates. Which is not the case under 13. Because 13 makes it clear that when a fundamental right comes in, the law is declared void. And void must mean ab initio. It cannot mean anything else. Another interesting thing, and this was raised by two learned judges in Dipchand's case. Suppose a law is declared void qua citizen. 19, for example, deals only with citizens. Would it be valid qua foreigner? And here Justice S.R. Das, speaking for himself and one other learned judge, again had a different vision, something like Justice Fazal Ali's, but which is not our law. And this vision was that yes, that same law which is declared void for a citizen is declared void only partially and would operate qua others. It would operate qua companies, it would operate qua foreigners, etc. But that was not accepted by the majority and has not been accepted in our law later, Mahendralal Jaini, etc. That whether it is from lack of legislative competence or it is because a fundamental right is violated are but two aspects of want of power, and voidness goes to the root. Voidness is ab initio. So the law is still more. These other interesting little conundrums, though they arose in a different context, throw a great deal of light also on legislative relations. And it is for a future constitution bench, maybe to re-examine or to examine afresh all these matters in the light of 251 in particular. We come to another interesting article, Article 252. Interestingly, all these articles except for 249 had their genesis in the Government of India. And equally, 252 was the old 104 or 106. And this article again is an interesting article in that it is the exact reverse situation of a subject to article in the 7th schedule. Now I have to explain myself. What is a subject to article in the 7th schedule? You have certain entries in list 2 and 3 which are subject to entries in list 1. One of them, for example, is the industries entry. Now, industries in entry 24 of list 2 is only with the states, unless there is a parliamentary declaration made in entry 52 stating that X, Y, Z, etc. are industries which we declare to be of national importance and therefore abstract you from your legislative competence, and we vest it in ourselves in Parliament. The exact converse is the 252 situation. Why do I say converse? Because here it is the state itself giving up its legislative power contained in list 2 to the center for a larger purpose, for a national purpose. And one of the legislations that has been made under this power is the well-known Urban Land Ceiling Act, which has now been repealed. So that a large number of states here cede to the center, as it were, the legislative competence over urban land, which is one part of land in entry 18, list 2. And once that is done, these states have ceded it once and for all. And the resolution ceding it, therefore, gives this power to Parliament. And unless Parliament makes an act, as it did later, giving this power back, that power has gone once and for all. So interestingly enough, again, you have a situation where the state list can be availed of by Parliament. Now look back again and see the number of situations in which Parliament can use the state list. First and foremost, under 246(4) for union territories, it can use the state list. First. Second, if there's a resolution passed by 2/3 present and voting of the Rajya Sabha, it can use the state list. Third, in an emergency situation, it can use the state list. Fourth, in a subject to situation, straightaway it's for Parliament itself to abstract to itself the legislative power given to the states and to say, hereafter only us, out you go. And fifth, a 252 situation where the states themselves can give up their power in national interest. All these are very interesting features which lead me now to another very, very interesting and seminal judgment of our court. State of West Bengal versus the Union of India. This again is a judgment where there is a minority opinion, that of the great Justice Subbarao. And this case arose in this situation. The state of West Bengal filed a suit against the Union of India, which it can do directly in the Supreme Court, for a declaration that a particular Coal Mining Areas Act, Central Act, is void. Why is it void? Because according to the states, the center cannot acquire state property without its consent. Because the state's argument was, we are sovereign within our sphere. And we are not citizens of this country. So you cannot use the doctrine of eminent domain against a sovereign power like the state. And this was seriously argued before a bench of 6 honorable judges. Chief Justice Sinha spoke for the majority. And he went into the Constitution in great detail, pointing out various aspects to show that ultimately, even though he didn't use the expression, we are really a quasi-unitary federation. We are not quasi-federal. And he went into these powers in great detail and laid down 4 very interesting propositions. He said that in a true federation, each of these 4 things have to be present, otherwise you can't call it a federation. First most important thing is that the states themselves must be sovereign authorities, governed by their own constitutions, who have ceded to the center part of their power. Most important, number 1. Number 2, not only should they have ceded this power, but if the federal constitution is to be amended, the voice should only be that of the states. And this you find in Article 5 of the US Constitution. Congress can only pass by a 2/3 majority of those present and voting a particular constitution amendment bill. Unless ratified by 3/4 of the states, no good. So this again is a second very important indicia of a true federation. Third is the subject we are dealing with, that you have separate legislative lists where the center and the states may legislate on subjects within their domain. And fourth, that you have an independent judiciary which then pronounces upon the constitution. So Chief Justice Sinha held that though we may have 3 and 4 1 and 2 are completely absent. And since 1 and 2 are completely absent, very difficult to call us a real federation. Except, of course, so far as the state of Jammu and Kashmir is concerned, which is again the very interesting sub-model within this model, where one state, you may call it a true federation in the sense that the state itself has its own list of subjects on which it legislates. Incidentally, Part 6 of our constitution, which deals with the states, doesn't apply to Jammu and Kashmir. There is no list 2 for Jammu and Kashmir. Very important. Jammu and Kashmir has its own list of subjects on which it can legislate. The residuary power is with the state. And most important of all, if the boundaries of the state are to be changed, they cannot be changed except with the consent of the state. Wholly unlike Articles 3 and 4, where the boundaries of the other states. So, we present a very interesting model or worldview, because within our so-called quasi-unitary federation, we have a very real federation as well, insofar as one state is concerned. And this brings me now to the final and most interesting article of this conspectus of articles, Article 254. Now, 254 deals only with the concurrent list, and again lays down what the Government of India Act laid down before, which is that if there is an existing law or if there is a parliamentary law and it is repugnant, what that means we'll come to a law made by the state in the concurrent list, the state law must give way. There's one exception. The exception is the state law is valid so far as that state is concerned and will override the central law, provided the president gives his assent. And that assent must be an assent which is demonstrated before a court of law to be an assent where the president has in fact applied his mind to the clash and finds that at least so far as this state is concerned, its own law should prevail, parliamentary law should not. Here again, interestingly enough, this time we borrow from the Australian Constitution. And if you remember, at the beginning of the talk I told you, the Australian Constitution, like the US Constitution, has no concurrent power. What it says in 109 is that when the state makes a law, which it may make under its constitution, there's no list 2, and there is some repugnance, the word used is repugnance, inconsistency, with a central law within its field, then the state law must give way. And for this, Nichols in his Australian Constitution has laid down that this repugnancy can occur in 3 different ways. First way is if there's an actual clash between the 2 legislations. Of course, state must give way. The second is if the parliamentary legislation evinces an intention to occupy the entire field. Therefore, there may be no clash at all. But if Parliament by a declaration says the field of mining, for example, is outside for you people, then notwithstanding that Parliament has made no law where a particular subject matter, yet the state can make no law. There will be repugnance implied. And the third is that assuming that there is no such intention of Parliament to occupy the entire field, if the subject matter in which the 2 laws operate is the same, then again there is repugnance. But interestingly enough, we took this from the Australian Constitution, which doesn't have a concurrent list. And this was taken in Zaveri by Amaidas's case first in 55, followed in Deepchand in 59. In the US also, there is no concurrent list. But one very interesting thing occurred when the Prohibition Amendment came in. The 18th Amendment, which brought in prohibition in the United States, specifically stated that Congress and the states will concurrently, the word used is concurrently, execute prohibition laws. And what came up before the Supreme Court in Rhode Island versus Palmer, 1920 judgment, was the meaning of the expression concurrent, because it had never been used in the Constitution. The argument made was concurrent means joint. So that unless both legislatures join each other in enforcing a prohibition law, or accept the fact that the other legislature has made a law and I accept that and join it, there can be no concurrent power. And interestingly, that was turned down in Rhode Island versus Palmer. But turned down without reasons. This is one of the very few remarkable judgments where propositions are laid down and no reasons given. And the minority says in an important judgment like this, it's amazing that no reasons are given. And the minority says, no, concurrent here must mean both legislatures applying their minds together and legislating together. So concurrent, therefore, has a completely different dimension in these countries, from which we have borrowed this theory of repugnance, point 1, point 2, point 3. And this really now brings me to the end of my talk. Did our founding fathers see right, or was there something wrong with their vision? I had appeared years and years ago with Palkhiwala in the first Minerva Mills case, which went on for about a month in our Supreme Court. And I remember a certain incident which took place. Justice Untwalia, who was a garrulous judge, was waxing eloquent on the socialist path that we had chosen. And Mr. Palkhiwala is getting more and more and more testy and nervous, twitching away. Yeah? And at one point, when the learned judge had not quite finished, Mr. Palkhiwala tells the learned judge, "Is your lordship quite finished?" So I said, "Yes, I finished." To which the reply was, "Not even a lunatic," and he shouted the word lunatic, "would cross the wall from West Berlin to enter into East Berlin." And that was like an atom bomb dropped. Because after that bomb was dropped, that learned judge didn't open his mouth for some time. Similarly, I wish to end this talk by saying that not even a lunatic would want the Jammu and Kashmir model for the rest of the country. Thank God the founding fathers chose what they chose. Thank you very much.